Hello, I'm Kristen Mounce, and I'm one of the healthcare providers at the Center for Respiratory and Sleep Medicine, and I'm going to teach you about COPD today. During this section, we'll learn about what COPD is, some of its symptoms, what causes it, and how it affects your lungs. I'll be covering a lot of information, but I'll do my best to explain everything clearly as we walk through it together. Remember that the more you know about your condition, the more you'll feel prepared to manage it in the way that works best for you. Now, let's get started. What is COPD? COPD stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Let's break down what each of those words mean. Chronic refers to a condition that either lasts for a long period of time or that never goes away. In COPD, it means the changes in your lungs will always remain the same, even if you feel better on some days. Obstructive means blocking or preventing. For people with COPD, this describes the feeling that less air is able to flow in and out of the lungs. Pulmonary disease refers to a condition that affects the lungs. What are the symptoms of COPD? By now, you probably already have some idea of what it feels like to live with COPD. People with COPD describe feeling short of breath. You may have noticed this when you do activities, like walking upstairs. Shortness of breath can get worse during respiratory tract infections, such as chest cold or pneumonia. People with COPD may also have a cough that won't go away, and when they cough, it can bring up mucus or phlegm from deep within their lungs. Some other symptoms I see less often are a feeling of tightness in the chest and wheezing, or a whistling sound coming from the lungs. COPD is a progressive disease. This means that it will keep getting worse at a faster rate over time if left untreated. This is especially true if the person with COPD continues to smoke or if their COPD repeatedly flares up. We'll talk about what a flare-up is in a few moments. Unfortunately, there is no cure for COPD. Once you get it, you will always have it. But the good news is that you can have control over how COPD makes you feel. With the right changes to your lifestyle and the right medicine, you may be able to breathe better. What causes COPD? COPD is a fairly common condition in the United States. It affects about 1 out of every 10 adults, or around 15 million people. There are a few different ways that someone can get COPD, but the most common is smoking. Over 80% of people who have COPD smoke tobacco, usually cigarettes. Smokers who are older or who have asthma are also more likely to develop COPD. About 15% of people with COPD get it by regularly breathing in chemicals, fumes, or other particles. Often, this happens in settings such as workshops or factories. Other times, people in this group get COPD by breathing in secondhand smoke. Finally, a very small number of COPD cases, about 1%, are caused by a problem in the lungs linked to genes passed down from parent to child. What does COPD look like in the lungs? To understand the problems that COPD is causing in the lungs, let's first take a look at how healthy lungs are supposed to work. Every time you take a breath, you are drawing air through your nose or mouth and down the windpipe, or trachea. Air travels down the windpipe into 2 large breathing tubes called bronchi. These bronchi lead to the left and right lungs. Inside the lungs, each of the bronchi split into many smaller tubes, like the branches of a tree. Eventually, these smaller tubes lead to small breathing sacs called the alveoli, which look like bunches of grapes. The alveoli are where oxygen from the air we breathe crosses into our bloodstream. From there, oxygen is carried by the blood all around the body. Whenever we breathe out, the process goes the other way. This means carbon dioxide passes out of the bloodstream, through the alveoli and bronchi, and then out through the windpipe when our lungs exhale. In a person with COPD, this process doesn't work as well as it should. Less air flows through the breathing tubes, so less oxygen enters the bloodstream. This can leave you feeling short of breath. Most people who have been diagnosed with COPD either have emphysema or chronic bronchitis. Emphysema happens when the small, grape-like breathing sacs become damaged and swollen. The walls between them break down, like lots of small bubbles joining to become one big bubble. This means less oxygen gets into the bloodstream, causing shortness of breath and other symptoms. Chronic bronchitis happens when irritation of breathing tubes makes them swollen and narrow. This leads to too much mucus being made, which can make it harder for air to travel in the lungs. A clear sign of this condition is a cough that brings up thick mucus on most days for at least 2 years. These aren't the only things which make it harder to breathe. Many people with COPD have trouble getting air out of their lungs too. This is because COPD can cause tightness in the muscles around the chest, which can make the breathing tubes shrink. Air moves out of the lungs so slowly that it becomes trapped. The person cannot finish one breath before they have to breathe in again. This is called air trapping. Air trapping can be very uncomfortable, leaving the person with COPD feeling short of breath all the time. Unfortunately, air trapping can get worse during exercise, which is an issue for many people with COPD because exercise can be a very important part of living well. While most cases of COPD have at least some of these symptoms in common, it's important to remember that no two cases are truly alike. COPD gets worse at different speeds in different people. Some people will have certain symptoms, while others may not. How is COPD diagnosed? If you recently have been told you have COPD, you might recognize some of the tests that we use to diagnose you. The most important test that we use to help diagnose COPD is a breathing test called spirometry. During spirometry, you're asked to take a deep breath and then force the air out of your lungs as fast as you can. This test is repeated several times. This tells us how well air flows from the lungs upon exhaling. We also conduct breathing tests to see if the person's airways are blocked. We can also test to see whether air is getting trapped in the lungs and to see whether a sufficient level of oxygen is crossing into the bloodstream. Some other things we do to determine whether a person has COPD are to conduct a medical history, do a physical exam, take blood tests, have the person perform a 6-minute walk test, fills out some questionnaires about health status, and sometimes take a chest X-ray or chest CT scan. You'll take some of these tests again even after you are first diagnosed. We may use them when you come in for a checkup to see whether your COPD has stayed the same or gotten worse. Taken together, these tests can help us provide you with the best possible plan to manage and treat your COPD. If you have been told that you have COPD, you should know that you have options. While there is no cure, there are steps you can take to improve the way you live your life with COPD. You'll hear about some of the ways to do that in the next section.